All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a good spring break. I know it's always a little hard to come back from spring break, but we do have a couple more weeks at the end of the semester here. I mentioned right before we left for spring break that we're headed into my favorite unit in this class, the unit that I think a lot of things are building up toward. I happen to like teaching persuasion a lot because this is where you all are most able to find your voices. A lot of people who struggle with persuasion don't really think that people will take them all that seriously. A lot of people think that they're better at persuasion than they actually are. We started off talking last time about stasis theory and different kinds of claims that we could have and how persuasion always deals with things that could be otherwise. Now, I know from teaching for almost a decade that oftentimes what happens is you all go away for spring break and everything that you learned before spring break kind of disappears and we have to play a little bit of catch up. So I'll spend some time doing that today, but I'll also tell you that we're going to build upon what we talked about the last time around. So if you weren't here or you're not really clear on stasis theory, you're probably going to want to get good notes from a classmate. I do have a lot of stuff for you in the textbook to help you make sense of this stuff. Persuasion is the hardest unit of this class. I think it's the most important and the most enjoyable for me, but it's usually, I find, the hardest for students to make sense of. I have a model that we're going to spend most of our time talking about today, and that model actually has 6 parts, but I only teach it with the 3 parts because those are kind of the main things you need to know. It's going to go back to that claim, evidence, and reasoning triangle that we talked about last time we met. So we're going to talk about persuasion, and the goal here is to help you get better at being persuasive when you make your own speeches. All of you are working towards a group deliberation that you'll give at the end of the semester. That is going to be an inherently persuasive speech, and a lot of students find it to be a difficult speech because it's persuasive. The good news there is that you'll be working together to help each other out with it. I know that group work is also one of those things that's kind of scary. We're going to spend time talking about that in a few weeks to get you ready to do that so you don't all kill each other. But essentially where we're headed is to help you get better at making and defending your own arguments, but also to recognize when other people are trying to persuade you, you can be a little bit more resistant to their persuasion. The last time we met, I think I told you all that I used to be the annoying one who was taking argumentation and persuasion classes as an undergrad. That's part of what drew me to communication and rhetoric specifically when I was your age. A lot of persuasion is not easy to do. And we talked about, in stasis theory, we talked about how we live in sort of this bumper sticker society or the Twitter society where a lot of people just like to throw out claims. A lot of those claims, if they're substantiated at all, are kind of weakly supported. So I want you to get better at recognizing when other people are making bad claims. I told you all that I was something of an internet troll back in the early days of the internet, not because I was trying to make everybody feel bad, but when you take classes in argumentation and persuasion, you realize that there's a lot of bad argumentation out there, and it's helpful sometimes to help other people see when their logic is flawed. Now, I told you I also don't want you all to become an army of internet trolls, and I'll tell you that the time in my life when I was kind of an internet troll was when I was a sophomore in college, and I told you all that the word sophomore comes from the roots in Greek that deal with sophistication and moron. And I was very much a sophisticated moron when I was 19. I'm teaching you this not so you can become morons and not so you control the internet, but instead so that you can become more sophisticated in your argumentation and you can make sense of other people's logic and reasoning and recognize when it's good and recognize when it's not so good. I had a friend who had a professor in undergrad who said, I want you to be open-minded, but I don't want you to be so open-minded that your brains fall out entirely. And that's what we're going to be dealing with today. I'm going to give you some strategies for how to deal with persuasion, especially persuasion that seems a little bit off to you, but you find it compelling, and you're not quite sure why it's not quite right. This is the kind of logic that you will use to decode why that persuasive argument is having the impact on you that it's having, and maybe you can slow down your urge to believe everything that you see or everything that you hear or everything that you read. So we're going to spend some time talking about persuasion in more detail today. I'll tell you that this is probably the hardest lesson that I teach in this class. A lot of people find it very difficult. There's a lot of big terminology. You're going to want to make sure you get some good notes. Again, if you don't have the notes from our lecture on stasis theory 2 weeks ago, you'll want to get those because we're going to build upon that. But we're going to work toward figuring out how the relationship among claim, evidence, and reasoning takes place. Now, I'll tell you that when I was in your shoes, part of what drew me to communication is because I wanted to become better at making arguments. And so I took classes in argumentation and persuasion theory, And I was the kind of kid who said, if I'm taking these classes, nobody's going to be able to beat me in debate. I'm going to have everything. I'm going to have all the right answers. I'm going to be able to call people on their bluffs. I'm going to call people out when they make logical fallacies. And my logic at the time was, if I just say the right thing in the right way, at the right time, in the right place, to the right people, that people will just bend to my whims, that I will be able to persuade whoever I want about whatever I want. And I was really excited about that until I got about halfway through my persuasion theory social science class, and we came across the theory that you see up on the screen here. That theory is a theory from 1965 called social judgment theory. And the basic premise behind social judgment theory is it's not just saying the right thing in the right place in the right time to the right people that makes persuasion happen. And it's not just the case where you have one persuasive interaction with somebody and magically they change their minds and they're like, you know what? Everything I've ever believed is wrong. You are right. Please teach me more, oh Savior, for all the things that you can teach me. So what social judgment theory essentially says is that a lot of people start off, whenever there's a controversy of some kind, they start off somewhere on a continuum. There's a range of possibilities about how they might feel about that particular topic. So if you look at the left side of the screen, you'll see strongly opposed to strongly in favor. And there's a whole bunch of ranges all the way in between there. If you look at the right side of the screen, you might see me trying to ask a girl out on a date. And what happens in social judgment theory is that persuasion doesn't operate just magically. If she's strongly opposed and I make the best case in the world, she's not going to be suddenly strongly in favor of my position. What's more likely to happen is she's going to be somewhere in the middle. So let's say she's slightly opposed. You know, I'm not really all that interested in you, but I do have a sister who might be right for you. She's kind of like, you know, she's not really interested. She's kind of trying to push you off. She's trying to do it gently. That position we're going to call her anchor position. Her anchor position is where she starts off without any persuasive attempt whatsoever. Where does she stand on this continuum, just looking me up and down? Am I attractive? Am I not attractive? Emotionally, physically? How does that work? So let's say she's slightly opposed to going out on a date with me. That's her anchor position. What social judgment theory says is that most people start off with an anchor position, and from that anchor position, they might move 1 or 2 or 3 places, but if she is moderately opposed, she's not going to suddenly want to marry me. And so what happens is they have a range. So if she's slightly opposed, she might become moderately opposed if I upset her. She might become very opposed very quickly if I say something offensive, or she might move more into the neutral realm. All of those positions that are not her anchor position, but positions that she'd be willing to accept after one persuasive interaction, all of those positions are what Sharif, and Nebergal call her latitude of acceptance. That is, I have my anchor position, but I also have a range of where I might be willing to go. You can probably guess where that's going then. There's also what they call the latitude of rejection. What that means is that no matter what happens, no matter how persuasive I might think I am, if she is slightly opposed, she might never be moderately in favor or strongly in favor of going on a date with me, let alone marrying me. So that's how this works, and what they're saying here is essentially that persuasion operates on a continuum. Most of the time when it happens, people move, but they only move a little bit if they move at all. There are some times when people do have an epiphany moment, and if they thought the world was flat and you teach them that the world is round, they're like, oh my gosh, this changes everything. Most persuasion, most of the time, however, operates sort of on this continuum, and people move gradually. They move slowly from one position to another. What's kind of still exciting about this, though, is that over time, you could extend somebody's latitude of acceptance. So if she starts off slightly opposed and then becomes neutral, I could maybe work her way up to suddenly going out on a date with me and eventually marrying me. Social judgment theory kind of explains why most people start off as friends and then they start dating. They date for a while, then they get engaged. Once they're engaged, they still see if this is working, and then they get married. This is how it works. It's not just one persuasive interaction, it's a bunch of persuasive interactions over time. So that's one perspective to keep in mind. And I share that perspective with you, hoping that you all will still nevertheless be interested in doing persuasion, and when you do, you'll be able to do it better. So what we're going to do today is extend upon this triangle. Last time we met, we just talked about claims, we talked about stasis theory. This time when we meet, we're going to extend that claim to the evidence being offered to support that claim and the reasoning that links the evidence to the claim. In this triangle, the reasoning is usually the weakest part of the whole argument. The reasoning is usually where the whole argument falls apart. So we're going to spend our time trying to figure out how to work at that reasoning, how to figure out what the reasoning is. We're going to have to do a little bit of working backwards. I'm going to start off working you forwards through it, and then we're going to do some working backwards because the reasoning is usually the part that's also left out of the argument. You, as the listener, as the receiver, have to fill in the gaps, and then you have to be able to evaluate that reasoning. So that's where we're headed. In order to get there, I do want to remind you all of what we talked about 2 weeks ago, and that is stasis theory. As I talked about last time, stasis theory is one of the theories from ancient Greece that helps us classify and clarify what it is that we're arguing about. And there's 5 different kinds of arguments that we could have, and the purpose of stasis theory is to stop us from having more than one argument at a time. Which kind of argument are we having? Because the kind of argument that we're having is going to have different ways that it operates, different criteria that make it a good or bad argument. So we have the stasis of factor conjecture, where we're arguing about things that are not yet matters of factual record, but things that if we had the right know-how could be matters of fact. So we're not talking about 2 + 2 = 4. That's established. That's not in the realm of persuasion. We're talking about things like whether it will or will not rain tomorrow, or whether aliens exist. Our stasis of definition then takes that question of whether a shared reality exists and say, okay, if we have this thing, what do we call it? Is it part of this category, or is it part of that category? Is it an X, is it a Y? Our causes and consequences is usually the easiest stasis for most of you to know, and that's a cause and effect relationship. If I do this thing, will it result in that other thing? Our value stasis is then a question of whether something is good or bad, or ethical or unethical, desirable, undesirable, beautiful, ugly. It's making some kind of judgment about a thing. Last but not least, we have the stasis of policy, and that is who should do what. Like I said, all of you are working towards a policy deliberation at the end of the semester where you're going to have some governing body, whether that's the US Congress, the North Dakota State Legislature, the Grand Forks City Council. Some governing body is going to make some kind of change to some existing policy. And you all are going to advocate for that change in policy, but that policy is usually dependent on the other 4 stases. What happens at one stasis doesn't usually stay at that stasis. And so I want you all to be familiar with all 5 of them to recognize how some of the questions that are unresolved at the earlier stases might then influence your policy deliberation. What I'm ultimately trying to get you to do is to give the best persuasive case that you all can give, and again, you're going to do that persuasion in groups. So in order to get there, we have to deal with a realm of philosophy called epistemology. I'm not going to expect you to know what that word means, but epistemology is just essentially the question of how do we know what we think we know? And most of the time, we know what we think we know because we either have established rules and things that we establish as fact, or we take things that are established as fact and try to apply them to things that we're not quite sure about. So what we have in epistemology is what we call the syllogism. It's the basic building block of argument. It's a 3-part structure. It's going to have a major premise. That's the thing we do know, or the thing we're pretty confident about. We have a minor premise. That's going to apply that rule from the major premise to something we're trying to figure out that we don't yet know about. And from that minor premise and that major premise, we're going to draw a conclusion. The conclusion should follow naturally from both of those premises. So we have a general rule, we try to apply it to a specific case, and then we can draw a conclusion based on that. You all are probably familiar with this if you've taken a geometry class or a philosophy or logic class. A lot of this consists of what we would call proofs. So we have this general principle, all rats are mammals. We know that from biology. We have a bunch of people who have categorized all of the different living things in the universe. And we say all rats are mammals. We know that they belong to this class. And we have this rat here. The rat's name is Fred. Fred is a rat. Therefore, what is the conclusion that we could draw from that? It should be pretty obvious. What's the conclusion that we would have to draw? Good. Fred is a mammal. Therefore, Fred is a mammal. We know that because we can follow the logical structure. So that's pretty straightforward. A lot of you so far are with me. That structure is what we call a syllogism. We have a major premise, some kind of general principle, a minor premise, and then from that minor premise, we can only draw the conclusion that we have here. There's a couple different types of syllogisms that you'll want to be familiar with. The first is what we call a categorical syllogism. That's the one I just gave you. All x's are y's. This is one that you all are pretty familiar with. Therefore, W is an X, therefore W is also a Y. So I know from my time working at a coffee shop, a general principle that surprised me when I started working there, that light roast coffee counterintuitively has more caffeine than dark roast coffees. Unlike a lot of other fruits and vegetables and other things that we eat, the darker the color usually means the more of a particular chemical in there. That's actually not the case with coffee. Light roast coffee and dark roast coffee don't have to do with the amount of caffeine that's in them in the sense that you'd expect. They do have to do with where in the world they're grown. A lot of light roast coffees are grown in Central and South America and Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of dark roast coffees are grown in places like Indonesia. And dark roast coffee actually usually has less caffeine than a light roast. And I share this with you because I could then apply that to my knowledge. So as I was working at this coffee shop, they would regularly have us taste test different coffees and talk about them. And they'd ask us, do you think this is a light roast or a dark roast? And I developed a pretty good taste for that. I can usually tell when I'm having a light roast coffee, and I can taste it right away. And I also know that if it's a light roast and it actually has more caffeine than a dark roast, halfway through it, I know because I'm pretty sensitive to caffeine, and I get pretty jittery. So if I take a sip of my coffee right before class and I say, oh, that's a light roast, I know that I probably don't want to finish that whole cup of coffee before class because it probably has more caffeine than a dark roast, and I'm probably going to be jittery, and I don't want to be standing here shaking in front of all of you. So I can probably presume that if I can taste that it's a light roast coffee, it's going to have more caffeine. That's a categorical syllogism. The next type we have is what's called a disjunctive syllogism. You all know this as an either-or scenario. Either I have option A or I have option B. I can't have both, so I have to choose. So I was out at dinner on Friday night, and the waitress came up to me, and they had appetizers, and she said, would you like the soup or the salad? And I said, I don't like salad. She knows that those are the only options that her restaurant has, and so she says, okay, soup it is. That's a disjunctive syllogism. We rule out one scenario, we are left with the other scenario. The third one we have then is what's called a hypothetical syllogism. This is your classic if-then scenario. If this happens, then that will also happen. So your if-then scenario is often the stasis of factor conjecture, trying to predict the future. We're trying to guess whether it's going to rain tonight. I want to know if it's going to rain tonight because I want to go to my soccer game. I look at the weather. The meteorologists are saying there's an 80% chance of rain. I'm going to presume that it's probably going to rain, and therefore I will not have a soccer game tonight. When we're dealing with syllogisms, we're dealing with logical propositions that are closely related so that you can only draw the conclusion that you see at the bottom here. And so far, I think you all are with me. What's going to get complicated is when we get beyond the syllogism. That's where I think some of you are going to get a little lost, so you're going to want to take good notes if you don't have them already. When we're dealing with syllogisms, we also like to deal with absolute scenarios. We like all or nothing. We like either A or B. We like to know what the right answer is. We like to have it in black and white. A lot of times, our syllogisms, unfortunately, are in the gray area. They're kind of in between. It's an 80% chance that it's going to rain, but there's still a 20% chance that it might not. Or maybe I say, I don't like salad, but they have soup, salad, and other appetizers that I could order. So most of the time when we're dealing with syllogisms, we're trying to get to absolute certainty. What I'm trying to do today by getting you all better at persuasion is to get more comfortable and more confident under conditions of uncertainty. I want you to be able to be pretty confident in the judgments that you're making, even if you can't have 100% certainty. I also want you to have a healthy skepticism when other people are trying to sell you something as 100% certainty when it's 80% or 70% or 30%. So that's where we're headed. In order to test whether we can buy the conclusion of a syllogism, there's two things we have to be able to look for. The first one is what philosophers call validity. And validity has to do with whether the syllogism follows the proper format. It has a major premise, it has a minor premise. The conclusion that you can draw follows from that major premise and minor premise. It's not tangential, it's not unrelated. We can draw that direct conclusion. So you'll see up on the left side of the screen here a proof that girls are evil. And it says girls are time times money, time equals money, girls equals money times money or money squared. Money is the root of all evil, therefore girls are the root of the square root of evil squared, therefore girls are evil. This is obviously a joke, but this is how logical proofs work when they are valid, and that's what you want to be checking for. You want to make sure that you can follow all of the steps in the process and that they only lead to the conclusion that you draw. The other part that you have to look for is what we call soundness, and soundness just means that the major premise and the minor premise are factually accurate. If one or both of those is flawed, then you still can't trust that conclusion. If both are sound and valid, then you have a syllogism that follows the proper format, and you can trust its conclusion because it's true. Now, there's a lot of syllogisms out there that look like they are both sound and valid, but are only one and not the other. So to give you an example, we could have a syllogism that is valid but not sound. All flying animals can shoot lasers from their eyes. Dogs can fly. If this were a valid and sound syllogism, what is the only conclusion that I could draw from that? Somebody raise their hand. What conclusion could I draw from this? Go ahead. Good. Therefore, dogs can shoot lasers from their eyes. That would be a conclusion that we could draw for this categorical syllogism, except it is valid but not sound. The individual premises, the major premise and the minor premise, are not factually accurate. Therefore, the conclusion is not factually accurate, even though in our heads we could conceive of a flying dog shooting lasers from his eyes. The premises aren't true, but they follow the right format. We still can't trust the syllogism there. The other type we could have is sound but not valid. That means that the individual premises are true, but they have no relationship to one another. So to start off, I had a sandwich for lunch yesterday. That's a true statement. Nancy Cartwright is the voice of Bart Simpson. Some of you might be surprised to know that Bart Simpson is played by a woman. That's also a factually accurate statement. Somebody else raise your hand and tell me what conclusion I can draw by pairing this major premise with this major premise and minor premise. Anybody? Go ahead. No conclusion. I can draw whatever conclusion I want, so I'm going to draw the conclusion, therefore the Earth revolves around the sun. There's no relationship between those two statements. They're all true, even the conclusion is true, but because they have no direct relationship to one another, we can't accept the conclusion as true in syllogistic format. We could also have syllogisms that are neither valid nor sound. All Germans spontaneously combust at age 34. My brother likes to eat bicycles, therefore I am a pregnant cat. I've seen speeches that look very similar to that one. Please don't do that to me. Make sure your syllogism follows the proper format. Make sure your major premise and minor premise are both factually accurate so that we can trust your conclusion as well. So that's how we talk in philosophy classes. That's how we do logic classes. I'll tell you that that's not how most people talk in everyday conversation. That's not how most people make decisions. That's not how most people use persuasion. If we had to talk this way all the time, we would have to say things like, people who are hungry should go eat food. I am hungry, therefore I should eat food. Nobody talks like that, or if they do, you probably want to punch them in the face. Most of the time, what you're going to get in everyday conversation is something like, I'm hungry, let's eat. If you talked like that, people would say, why don't you just eat already, right? Most of the time, people say, I'm hungry, let's go eat. We don't need the first major premise there. Most of us buy the logic of people who are hungry should eat food, and we buy that logic because we know what happens to us if we don't eat food. We start losing weight, and eventually, if we lose enough weight, we die. But also, most of us just don't like the comfort of being hungry. So we don't need that major premise, and that's how we talk in everyday conversation. It's usually leaving the major premise out entirely. That term of leaving the major premise out entirely and just giving the minor premise and conclusion is what Aristotle in his book, The Rhetoric, calls an enthymeme. And an enthymeme is actually something he talked about as a part of speech, and a very important part of speech. And this is really interesting. He talks about it as a way of making persuasion happen, but the audience kind of has to fill in the gaps. The word enthymeme comes from the Greek word thumos. Thumos in ancient Greek was kind of like your heart. It was kind of like your soul or your spirit. And people who were making arguments were trying to appeal to your heart, but you as the listener kind of had to fill in the gaps of what they left out. Enthymemes more closely resemble how we actually talk when we make arguments. And they usually do so by leaving out the major premise, because again, most of us will accept the major premise at face value. Most of the time, it's something as basic as people who are hungry should eat. But oftentimes, that major premise is something that's uncertain. It's that there's an 80% chance of rain today, so if it rains, then maybe I won't have soccer tonight. It's not entirely clear. And so what we're dealing with an enthymeme is the missing premise that is usually uncertain, and when it's left out, it's usually left out because it's flawed in some capacity. So just to recap here, so you're all on the same page with me, our syllogism is all three of those parts: the major premise, the minor premise, conclusion. It's predictable, it's formulaic, and most of the time, if we talk like that, our audience would probably fall asleep or they'd get tired of listening to us. They'd say, yeah, I know, I get it. The other thing about syllogisms is they usually work best for situations when we have absolute scenarios, when we have all or nothing, either A or B. If X happens, then Y definitely will happen. When we're talking about enthymemes, we're usually not in that realm of absolutes. We're usually in the gray area where there's room for persuasion. There's some capacity for surprise with enthymemes, and that's because you have to fill in the part that the speaker left out. It also helps us as the speaker to disguise parts of our logic, and usually the weakest part of our argument is the part that we choose to leave out. And we choose to leave it out because if we actually said it in our speech, our audience would pick up on the fact that it's flawed. If we leave it out of our speech, the audience has to do some mental gymnastics in order to figure it out. Enthymemes also work really well in conditions of uncertainty. Most of the time when we're dealing with an enthymeme, that's what we have, and we have to be comfortable with some degree of uncertainty. We have to ask ourselves how much uncertainty we're willing to tolerate. Some people have high tolerance for uncertainty. For some people, uncertainty is really anxiety-producing. Now, the reason I share all of this with you is because your ability to decode an enthymeme and get it back into a syllogism is what's going to make you more resistant to other people's arguments, especially other people's weak arguments. It's also going to help you find the weakest parts of your persuasive speech. If the goal is to find your voice, if the goal is to be taken seriously by other adults, you want to be able to recognize the weakest part of your arguments, because anytime that you present, some adult who's maybe 20 or 30 years more experienced than you is going to raise their hand, and they're going to have the hardest Q&A question that they could possibly ask you. I want you to be prepared in that moment. I want you to have already thought through the part of your argument that's the weakest part so you have a good response and aren't caught as a deer in the headlights. So I'm going to walk you through a couple examples. The goal of today is to try and to be able to work backwards from an enthymeme to a syllogism. And I'll give you the process for how to do that. I'm going to help you out here. So we have an enthymeme that I've taken. It was a thesis statement from a speech that a student gave a few years ago when I taught in Texas. And the student said, the US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods because it will help fight obesity. Within that sentence, within that thesis statement, there is a claim, and there's also support for that claim. It's a little confusing because the support for that claim is, in this case, another claim. If you think about stasis theory, you actually have two different persuasive claims going on here. One of them is being used in service of the other. So I'm going to help you out with this one because it's a little bit tricky. But if you look at this, we have what somebody should do, and we have why they should do it. So the should is the bigger claim here. That's what we're dealing with in that triangle. The US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods. Period, full stop, that's a claim. We could say they should or they should not. That's a claim at the stasis of policy. The reason I said you want to be familiar with the 5 stases is so you can recognize what's a claim and what's not a claim, but also to recognize what kind of claim you're dealing with. So that's our claim that we're dealing with here. The US Congress should tax fatty and sugary foods. That's our first step, is to identify what the claim is. The second step is to identify what the evidence for that claim is. That evidence is going to be the minor premise of our syllogism. Somebody tell me what the evidence being offered here for why the US should raise taxes on fatty and sugary foods. What's the evidence being offered to support that claim? I'll give you a hint, it's the rest of the sentence. Okay, we're a little bit stuck here. That's all right. I recognize these are tough. We're going to work through them. I am going to encourage you all to be brave and raise your hands. I know it's a little scary that you might be wrong. I want to help you understand this. It is important for you to get. So the evidence being offered here for why the US Congress should do that is because raising taxes on fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity, or at least that's what our student wanted us to believe. So we've got the claim the US Congress should do this, the evidence for why they should do it. If we're working backwards, what we need to do is actually start at the bottom of our syllogism. We identify the conclusion first, we work backwards to the minor premise, and then from there we work backwards to the major premise, that what the student didn't say. Oftentimes when we have persuasion, what somebody doesn't say is usually more interesting than what they do say. So if we were to work backwards and we want this to be both a valid and sound syllogism, the only way we could say that is that raising taxes on goods will help limit consumption. That is the missing premise of what the student left out. We're going to come back to that in a minute here. But that's the kind of work that you're going to have to do. It's that enthymeme filling in with your heart or your soul or with logic and reasoning. How do you get back to what the speaker is not saying? And that's what's ultimately going to help you figure out the weakest part of their argument, because you'll see in a minute why that major premise in a lot of ways is flawed. Now, if you're going to check an enthymeme's logic, that's the process that you're going to follow for it. You're going to start with the conclusion. You're going to identify that claim. You're going to use stasis theory to help you identify that conclusion. That conclusion is always going to be something persuasive, something that could be otherwise. And it's going to be a claim at one of the 5 stases: factor, conjecture, definition, causes and consequences, value, or policy. You're going to want to know what the claim is, and you're going to want to know what kind of claim it is, so stasis theory is going to help you there. Once you've identified that claim, you want to work backwards and figure out what's the premise used as support. In our claim, evidence, and reasoning triangle, that's the evidence part. What is the speaker telling you as to why you should believe their position on that particular issue? Once you have that claim, once you have that conclusion, once you have that evidence, that's when you're going to work backwards and try and figure out the missing reasoning that the speaker is not saying. That's what Stephen Toulmin called the warrant. It's our major premise most of the time in our syllogism. And once you've figured out what that missing premise, what that reasoning is as part of that triangle, the reasoning is usually where the argument falls apart. It's usually the weakest part of that, so you want to test or cross-examine that missing premise. You want to say, they're saying one thing, but do I actually believe what they're saying? And actually, most of the time, they're not even saying it. When you're testing that warrant is often some kind of an assumption. And I gave you a maxim that I learned in high school from one of my high school teachers who got it from somebody who got it from somebody. Never assume because it only... I gave this to you a couple weeks ago, it's okay. Never assume because it makes an ass out of you and me. Our assumptions are usually the weakest part of the argument. Our assumptions are the part that are usually left out. We want to be able to test what the speaker is not saying as much as we're testing what the speaker is saying. Otherwise, we're going to be inclined to accept a claim just based on the evidence that the person's offering and not the link between that evidence and that claim, which is usually the weakest part. So let's test this out a little bit. We have our claim of raising taxes on fatty and sugary foods will help fight obesity. Like I said before, that's a causal claim in service of the larger policy claim that the US government should raise taxes on these kinds of foods. So there's a couple of things that premise does tell you. There's a couple of things that it also doesn't tell you. One of those things that it doesn't tell you is that there are a lot of companies who sell you fatty and sugary foods. I usually come in with one of them to drink. I like my sugary drinks, so I usually have one with me. There's a lot of companies that are trying to sell you sodas and sports drinks, chips and cookies and things like that. Those companies don't want you to raise taxes on those things because they're going to lose major profits if you do raise those taxes. A lot of people also like fatty and sugary foods, and even if you raise taxes on them, they're going to continue to consume them. A lot of US Americans were surprised after 9/11 that they were willing to pay double or triple the amount of money for gasoline that they were prior to 9/11. Gas prices went way up. People still needed to go to work, so raising taxes or raising costs of gas didn't stop people from consuming gasoline. They still needed to get to work. A lot of people find that fatty and sugary foods have something of an addictive quality to them, and even if they're not addictive, we still enjoy them, and we might be willing to pay more for them in the same way that a lot of people are willing to pay for alcohol or cigarettes. Another thing that this doesn't tell you is that raising taxes won't necessarily fight obesity if consumption is not the only cause of obesity. So some people are genetically predisposed to react more to certain kinds of food. Some people have different body types. Some people have sedentary lifestyles. Some people have active lifestyles. So even if we can reduce people's consumption of fatty and sugary foods, doesn't necessarily mean that it will actually fight obesity. And these are some of the things that I had to say to this student, not so much in terms of lowering her grade, but just kind of making her aware of some of her own assumptions. I show this to you because a lot of you, when I showed you the original syllogism, probably were like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. And the more you start thinking about what the speaker's not saying, the more critical you can be and the more likely you are to resist the kind of persuasive claim that that speaker's going to have. So at the end of the day, what I want you to be able to do is to be able to work backwards from syllogism to enthymeme. I want you to be able to practice this. I want you to be able to apply it. I don't think that I can teach you entirely how to do it in 50 minutes. It is one of those things where it usually has to get introduced in class, and then you have to work through a bunch of examples on your own. I'm going to walk you through some examples. Most of my examples are going to be goofy ones just to help you get the point. I want you to be okay taking risks and raising your hand and trying to answer my questions, because this is going to help you learn. Where we have confusion is where we can grow. So I want you to test out how you can work backwards from an nth meme to a syllogism. We're going to do some kind of goofy examples. I have one serious example. There are a couple more examples in your textbook with an answer key to help you figure out how to do this. It's important that you learn how to do it because it's honestly, there's no other way I can put it than it's going to make you smarter. That's what I want. I want you to be smarter. I want you to get better at making and resisting persuasive claims. So we're going to start off with a holiday that we celebrated a few weeks ago. It's a holiday that a lot of North Dakotans groan at. I'll tell you that I came here most recently from Pennsylvania. I came from a place about 45 minutes from Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, which is where they host Groundhog's Day. There's this groundhog here known as Punxsutawney Phil. He's the official groundhog for Groundhog's Day. I've got him here with Bill Murray from the movie Groundhog's Day. Our logic, our nth meme that we're given here is Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. It looks like there will be 6 more weeks of winter this year. One of those sentences is something that we take at face value, something that is factual, something that cannot be otherwise, something that we all agree upon and therefore is not part of the realm of persuasion. The other statement here is one that could be otherwise. It could be true, it could not be true. When we are working backwards from an nth meme back to a syllogism, we want to start off with the one that could be otherwise. So somebody be brave and raise your hand. Tell me which of these 2 sentences is the persuasive sentence. Yeah. Yeah, the second one. Why is it the second one? Good, yeah, if we change the word will to could, there could be 6 more weeks of winter, there could be 2 more weeks of winter. That's what happens when the groundhog doesn't see his shadow. There could be 2 weeks, there could be 6 weeks, there could be in North Dakota 15 weeks of winter left. We don't know, but we are making that persuasive claim. So that's our conclusion. What then is the evidence being offered in this nth meme to support that conclusion? I'll give you a hint, it's the other sentence. Go ahead. Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. That's not something that could be otherwise. He either saw it or he didn't see it. We can observe that with our own eyes. We can tell that Punxsutawney Phil saw his shadow. So we've got our claim, the second sentence. We've got our evidence, the first sentence. There's a third sentence here that's missing. That would be the direct link from the from the claim or from the evidence to the claim. That's our reasoning that we're going to be looking for. I'll give you a hint here for those of you who took good notes today. I'll tell you that this is what we call a hypothetical syllogism. So if you were to try and recreate this as a hypothetical syllogism, what would the major premise be? Yeah. Good, yeah. Our hypothetical syllogism is our if-then scenario. If Punxsutawney Phil sees his shadow, then there will be 6 more weeks of winter. That's the missing premise that's not given here. All of us kind of just see Groundhog's Day and we nod and smile and think it's cute. What's the problem with that if-then reasoning here? Why is it not the case, or maybe not the case, that we can tell based on Punxsutawney Phil seeing his shadow how much winter is left? What's the problem there? Is there a problem there? I hope there's a problem there. Yeah, that if-then reasoning doesn't make any sense. The only way it could make sense is if groundhogs actually could predict the weather, and there's a nice picture of Punxsutawney Phil saying, I'm a rodent, not a meteorologist. There's no correlation between this weird holiday that we invented probably in the 1800s and predictions of the weather. So it doesn't work. It's a flawed premise. We had to work backwards to the reasoning to figure out where this goes wrong. So I've ruined Groundhog's Day for you. Now I'm going to ruin one of your favorite childhood stories. I'm going to ruin Cinderella. Let's try this again. I know it's not always easy. You all are doing pretty well so far. So again, we want to go through those 4 steps. We want to start off by identifying what is our conclusion, what is our claim, what is the thing here that could be otherwise. Which sentence is it in our nth meme? Okay, you say the first one. Why is it the first one? Why is that one persuasive? Why is that a claim? Good, and why is that persuasive? Yeah, she could be the one, it could be otherwise. She must be the girl, she might not be the girl. That's our claim that we're going to start with. What then is our evidence for that claim? What evidence is being offered here? Go ahead. Yeah, so we have this glass slipper. The prince is going around to all these different women, having them try it on. They're trying to make it fit their feet. It doesn't quite fit. When he puts the shoe on Cinderella, it fits perfectly. What then is the missing premise that we would have to accept in order to get from the shoe fit Cinderella's foot to Cinderella must be the one who left the glass slipper at the ball? Okay, so we know it's her, but what's the direct link between one and the other? What would we have to accept as true in order to get from it fit her foot to she must be the one who left it behind? Yeah. Good. The missing premise that we have to accept in order for that to be true is all women have different sized feet. This is why we love that scene in Cinderella when her stepsisters are trying it on and they're trying to cut their feet off to get it to fit. The stepmother tries to get it on, it doesn't quite fit, she tries to bend it, right? The premise here is that all women have different sized feet, and therefore Cinderella can be the only one who fits into that shoe, and she has to be the one who left it at the ball. Now, I'll tell you that I have two older sisters, and both of my sisters have the same size feet. And ladies, tell me what happens when you have a sister and she has shoes that you like and you have the same size feet as her. What happens? She steals your shoes, right? My sisters steal each other's shoes. They steal each other's clothing all the time. My brother's always stealing my shirts. The premise here is flawed because there could be 10 other women in that kingdom who fit into that glass slipper. Now, we know as observers that it has to be Cinderella, but the only reason we know that is because we get the third-person bird's-eye view version of the entire story, and we actually watched Cinderella leave that glass slipper behind because she didn't want to turn into a pumpkin. But it could equally be the case that some woman who's not Cinderella or anyone related to her is the owner of that actual glass slipper. It's a flawed premise. Let's try another one here. I've got an internet meme for you. Let's see if we can figure out, again, what the conclusion is, work backwards from that claim or conclusion to the evidence being offered for it. Then we'll get into the territory of the reasoning linking the two and why it's flawed. Anybody want to try and tell us what the conclusion of this internet meme is? Yeah. Okay. That the spellings G-H-O-T-I and F-I-S-H are equally valid ways of spelling and pronouncing the word fish. That's our conclusion. What then is our evidence being offered to support that conclusion? Yeah, so we've got these examples, the word enough, the f sound, the word women, the I sound, the word nation, the sh sound, sh, it's pronounced fish. That's the evidence being given for why G-H-O-T-I and F-I-S-H are both equally valid spellings and pronunciations of that word. In order to accept that as true, there's a third missing premise, the reasoning that would link those two, that would tell us that those are equally valid. What is that missing reasoning? Let's see if we can figure that one out. That's the hardest part of this. Somebody be brave and try and tell me why, what we would have to accept in order for that to be true. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, essentially that the English language is consistent in its spellings and pronunciations. So we would have to assume that English is internally consistent and that all words are pronounced a particular way, like they are in Spanish, like they are in Arabic, that we don't have all these weird exceptions and dropped letters and silent letters that we get from Anglo-Saxon and French and this bastardization of English that we have. We would have to accept that English is internally consistent with its spellings and pronunciations. Now, I'll tell you that I was at a job interview for a writing center job a few years ago, and they asked me, we do a lot of work with international students. How would you work with international students? And my response to them was, Well, I've spent the last 2 years learning biblical Hebrew. The only thing that I could think of that would be worse than learning biblical Hebrew would be learning English. And they all laughed and smiled, and lo and behold, I got the job. So English is not internally consistent. We got another case of flawed reasoning. Let's do another one here. Leeches will cure what ails you. They'll get rid of all that bad blood. And when I'm talking about bad blood, I'm not talking about that horrible Taylor Swift song. But this is actual reasoning that people used to use in the Middle Ages to try and help people when they were sick. Let's see again if we can figure out what's the conclusion and then what's the evidence being offered for it. Anybody want to try and tell us what the claim is? Go ahead. Good. So leeches will cure what ails you is our conclusion. Leeches either will fix or they won't fix. It could be otherwise. What's the evidence being offered for why leeches will make you feel better? Yeah, so leeches will get rid of bad blood. What then is the missing premise that we have to accept in order to buy that conclusion? Yeah, that bad blood is the source of your problems. We have to assume that there exists good blood and bad blood. We also have to presume that leeches are smart enough to know the difference, and leeches are blind and they're kind of stupid animals. When people used to cover themselves in leeches all the time to try and drain what they thought was bad blood. We know from our medical science and our technology that that's not actually what makes people sick, and actually that draining any blood, whether it's good blood or bad blood that don't exist, is bad for you usually when you are sick. And so this was flawed logic that was nevertheless operational for a very long time. We'll try one more example, and this one's a serious example. This is what I was trying to build toward. This is what enthymemes usually look like in everyday life. This is what you're going to have to deal with, and oftentimes they're going to be about things that you care about personally. So I've got an example up here. I've got a couple different possible types of reasoning. I'll give you those 4 steps again to help you think through this one. You want to identify the conclusion, the evidence being offered for that conclusion, the reasoning that links the evidence to that conclusion, and then the flaw in the reasoning. So there's only one way that we could make a syllogism out of one of these answers that is both sound and valid. Take a second to work through it. I'll have you raise your hands and tell me which one you think it is. But again, figure out the claim, figure out the evidence to support the claim, figure out the reasoning that would directly link that evidence to that claim. And from there, we'll talk about why this particular premise might be flawed. Give you a second to think through it. It might help you to rewrite it as a syllogism. That's usually what you have to do in order to work backwards. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so. Raise your hand if you think the answer here is A. Anybody? Not sure? Raise your hand if you think it's B. A couple of you. Raise your hand if you think C. Raise your hand if you think D. Raise your hand if you're tired and it's after spring break and you're tired of me asking you questions and this is a lot of material to cover. Yeah, I know. I want you to be able to work through this. I'll tell you that those of you who did raise your hands, or the vast majority of you who raised your hands, were correct. It is B here. And the reason for that is it's the most direct link between the claim and the evidence being offered for that claim. All of the other ones, if you were to plug them in as the major premise, would be invalid because there's no direct correlation among the different premises to lead to that conclusion. Now, a lot of people will try to make this argument. If we've identified B as our major premise, I've told you that most of the time the major premise is flawed. What are some things that you could think of if you were trying to make sure that your tuition doesn't go way, way up when people are making this argument? How would you attack the major premise B here? What would you say in response? Can you think of any reasons why that might be bad logic? Yeah, it used to be the case in the 70s and 80s that higher education was what was seen in economics as a public good. That is, it's something that the entire state or the entire tax base would contribute to. Even if they weren't directly benefiting from it, they would get indirect benefits from it. And so in the 70s and 80s, a lot of states and a lot of the US government would have taxes specifically designed for higher education that you as a property owner or you as a taxpayer would have to pay in order to subsidize the cost of higher education so it doesn't skyrocket. And what happened is that a bunch of people saw that as a public good, and they said, even if I don't have a kid in college, or even if my kid's already graduated, the people who are getting educated are likely to stay in my state, and they are likely to contribute to the workforce. They're likely to boost the economy once they graduate, so it's still worth my money to help offset the cost of it. And so we would have in the state of North Dakota 750,000 people paying a small tax so that your tuition doesn't go up to, let's say, $40,000 or $50,000 a year like it is at some of the Ivy Leagues. The reason why this logic is kind of flawed is if you stop seeing higher education as a public good that is taxpayer funded and taxpayer supported, that means that the costs of everything that happens at the university then depend on you, the students. What do you think is going to happen if that money that otherwise would have come from taxes gets cut? Who's going to make up for it? It's going to be all of you, and your tuition is going to skyrocket. You can actually chart this. There are charts from the 70s and 80s through today about the decline in state support going along with the rise in your tuition dollars. And part of the reason why your tuition is so expensive is because people have started to believe B. So again, I share this with you not because it's all abstract things about leeches and about Cinderella, but because it's often about things that you care about. If you can find the flaw in other people's arguments, you can then better defend your own arguments in response to them. So I'm going to leave you there. I know this is challenging. There's a couple examples in your textbook. I want you to work through this. Again, this is one of those things that's going to make you smarter and more persuasive and help you find your voice. So I'll leave you there, and I'll see you all next week.